Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. I'd love to have a chat today about, we've talked about ADHD in a number of episodes, and it's probably something that I will focus on disproportionately, no pun intended, because it's something really important for those who have it, to basically figure out how to make the most out of their brain. And I'd love to chat today about the big question, I think, in ADHD treatment of stimulant versus non-stimulant medication. I've tried both of them, and I'm one of maybe the majority, although I'm not sure, that didn't find non-stimulants effective or good, basically. The appeal, my blood pressure has always been a little high, even before starting any ADHD drugs. So stimulants I have to be careful about. And I think there has to be a huge amount of people who are at exactly that intersection, where you've got, the prevalence of hypertension is huge. The good thing, and of course we're not giving any individual medical advice on this podcast, not for me, not for anyone who's listening. The good thing is that there are ways you can take a antihypertensive and an ADHD drug, and as long as you're monitored, I can attest personally that it's not a blocker, put it like that. But one easy out on paper, at least, is using a non-stimulant drug, because you don't have the inherent blood pressure raising effects. The other reason, I think, is when we're talking about treating ADHD with stimulants, I think a lot of us would prefer it was a bit of a less blunt instrument. We're targeting focus, but we're also getting, especially when you're starting these drugs, they can cause feelings of anxiety, and they can be brutal for insomnia. Really, you can. They're very hard in that respect. So the appeal of a non-stimulant drug for me is, well, if we can tackle this through a different avenue, that seems like the way to go. I'd love to learn a bit more, if we can get into it in this podcast, about dopamine and norepinephrine, because when we talk about non-stimulants, we're often talking about I'm trying to remember all these acronyms. Noradrenaline reuptake inhibitors, selective noradrenergic reuptake inhibitors, and noradrenaline and dopamine often get bucketed together, or kind of thought of as almost the same thing. But my personal experience I remember taking Strattera, which is atomoxetine, and feeling basically like really stressed without any of the kind of useful focus. And I came back reluctantly to Vyvanse. And I say reluctantly because, as we talked about in a previous episode, one other potential appeal for non-stimulants is that stimulant medications are so tightly controlled that the bureaucracy and the ease of access is often actually a legitimate problem for patients. And sometimes it's just the difference between a scheduled and a non-scheduled medication makes the difference between having to go in on the exact prescription day and being treated, with great challenges at a pharmacy, versus them handing out cartons of the stuff and saying, do you want to take 6 months while you're here? And you're like, no, thank you very much. Just what the doctor prescribed. So I personally didn't have a very effective trial on it, but nevertheless, I'm very curious to know always where ADHD treatment is going, because we asked the same question, I think, about SSRIs in another episode. We have good treatments today, which is great, and I certainly don't take that for granted. But the course of pharmacotherapy is always evolving, and I'm wondering what might come next as well. So Herman and Corn, let's talk about non-stimulant medications for ADHD, how doctors handle that common comorbidity, ADHD in a hypertensive patient, and what is going to be coming next. Do you think that we're going to find some kind of sweet spot maybe that takes the effectiveness of medications like Adderall, Ritalin, Vyvanse, and the slightly easier ride that might come from some of these non-stimulant drugs? Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. We are coming to you from our usual spot in Jerusalem, and today we are diving into a topic that hits close to home for a lot of people, including our housemate Daniel. He actually sent us a voice note this morning about something he has been navigating lately, which is the really complex world of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder medications.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I'm ready to get into the weeds on this one. Daniel's prompt is fascinating because it touches on that very specific tension between what works for the brain and what the body can actually handle. He is dealing with that classic trade-off between the effectiveness of stimulants and the physical side effects, particularly when you have something like high blood pressure in the mix.
It is a tough spot to be in. He mentioned that he has tried non-stimulants like Strattera and found them lacking, but stimulants like Vyvanse or Adderall come with that cardiovascular baggage. And then there is the whole bureaucratic nightmare of actually getting those prescriptions filled because of how they are scheduled.
Right, and we have touched on some of these themes before. I think back to episode 102, where we talked about the bureaucracy of the medication maze, and episode 366, where we looked at the neuroscience of late diagnosis. But today, I want to really focus on the chemistry. Why do these drugs feel so different? Why does one give you focus while the other just makes you feel like you drank 10 cups of coffee and then got stuck in traffic?
That is a great way to put it. Daniel specifically asked about the roles of dopamine and norepinephrine. So, Herman, let's start there. In the context of ADHD, what are these two chemicals actually doing, and how do the different classes of medication play with them?
To understand this, we have to look at the catecholamine hypothesis of ADHD. Basically, the idea is that the ADHD brain has a bit of a supply and demand issue with two main neurotransmitters, dopamine and norepinephrine. Dopamine is often called the reward chemical, but in the prefrontal cortex, it is more about signal-to-noise ratio. It helps you focus on the important thing by making it more rewarding or salient.
So it is the this matters chemical.
Exactly. It helps you stay on task because it provides that internal thrum of engagement. Norepinephrine, on the other hand, is closely related to adrenaline. Its job is to reduce the background noise. It helps with alertness and arousal. If dopamine is the spotlight, norepinephrine is the guy turning off the other lights in the theater so you can see the stage.
Okay, that makes sense. So where do the medications come in?
Stimulants, like the methylphenidates, think Ritalin or Concerta, and the amphetamines, like Adderall or Vyvanse, are very effective because they hit both. They increase the levels of both dopamine and norepinephrine in the synaptic cleft. They do this by blocking the reuptake, meaning the brain doesn't vacuum them up as fast, and in the case of amphetamines, they actually prompt the brain to release more.
And that is why they feel so powerful. You are getting the spotlight and the darkened theater at the same time.
Precisely. But Daniel's experience with Strattera, which is the brand name for atomoxetine, was very different. Strattera is what we call a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, or an SNRI. It specifically targets norepinephrine. It does not have a direct, significant effect on dopamine in the reward centers of the brain, although it does increase dopamine slightly in the prefrontal cortex as a side effect of how norepinephrine transporters work there.
So, if it is mostly hitting norepinephrine, why did Daniel say it made him feel stressed without the focus?
That is the big complaint with Strattera. Because it is amping up norepinephrine everywhere, it can trigger the body's fight or flight response. If you are increasing norepinephrine but not getting that hit of dopamine to provide the reward or the purpose for that alertness, you just feel alert. You feel on, but you don't necessarily have a direction to point that energy. That is why people describe it as feeling like physical anxiety or stress. Your heart rate might go up, you might feel jittery, but your brain is still wandering around looking for something interesting to do.
It is like having a car with a high-revving engine, but the transmission is stuck in neutral. You are making a lot of noise and burning fuel, but you aren't going anywhere.
That is a perfect analogy. And for some people, That extra norepinephrine eventually helps the brain regulate itself over several weeks, but for others, the side effects just drown out any potential benefit.
So let's talk about the blood pressure issue. Daniel mentioned he has to be careful with stimulants because his blood pressure is already a bit high. This seems like a really common catch. 22. You need the meds to function, but the meds might be a risk for your heart. How do doctors actually navigate that?
It is a major clinical challenge. Hypertension, or high blood pressure, is incredibly common, and so is ADHD. When you combine them, you are essentially trying to treat a brain that needs more stimulation while protecting a vascular system that needs less. The first thing a good psychiatrist or cardiologist will do is try to get the blood pressure under control independently. Often they will use something like a beta blocker or an ACE inhibitor.
But wait, don't some ADHD medications actually help with blood pressure? I remember reading about certain non-stimulants that were originally blood pressure meds.
You are thinking of the alpha-2 agonists. This is where the sweet spot starts to appear, or at least a different way of thinking. Drugs like guanfacine, brand name Intuniv, and Conadine brand name Capvi, were originally developed to treat high blood pressure. They work by stimulating alpha-2 adrenergic receptors in the brain, which actually has a calming effect on the sympathetic nervous system.
So they lower blood pressure and help with ADHD. That sounds like a win-win for someone like Daniel.
It can be. They aren't usually as punchy as stimulants for pure focus, but they are excellent for the emotional regulation, impulsivity, and hyperactivity sides of ADHD. In a patient with hypertension, a doctor might prescribe a stimulant but buffer it with guanfacine. The guanfacine helps keep the blood pressure and heart rate lower while also providing some cognitive benefits, allowing a lower dose of the stimulant to be more effective.
That is fascinating. So it is a cocktail approach rather than a single silver bullet. But I imagine that adds even more complexity to the bureaucratic hurdles Daniel mentioned. If you are juggling 3 different scripts just to get your brain to work, the room for error or pharmacy drama goes way up.
Oh, the bureaucracy is the silent killer of ADHD treatment. Because stimulants are Schedule II controlled substances in the United States and similarly restricted in many other countries, you have these rigid rules. You can't get refills. You need a new prescription every 30 days. You can't pick it up early. And even now, in February 2026, we are still feeling the tail end of those massive shortages that started years ago.
I saw some news about that recently. Didn't the DEA just increase the production quotas for this year?
They did. Just last month, the DEA raised the production ceiling for Adderall-related ingredients by about 14% and Vyvanse by 22%. It is a win for advocacy groups, but on the ground, patients are still stuck calling 20 different pharmacies like they are looking for a rare collectible.
It is a man-made crisis, like we said in episode 102. It is wild that we treat people who have a disorder characterized by executive dysfunction and forgetfulness by giving them the most bureaucratically demanding task imaginable every single month.
It is cruel, honestly, and that is why the appeal of non-stimulants is so high. Strattera or Qelbree are not scheduled. You can get a 90-day supply mailed to your house. No one treats you like a criminal at the pharmacy counter. For many patients, the effectiveness of a drug isn't just about the neurochemistry, it is about the access to benefit ratio. If a drug is 80% as effective as Adderall, but 100% easier to actually get, that might be the better choice for your life.
But for Daniel, it sounds like the effectiveness just wasn't there. If the non-stimulant doesn't work, the ease of access doesn't matter. So, let's look at the future. Daniel asked if we will ever find that sweet spot. Something as effective as Vyvanse, but as easy to handle as a non-stimulant. What is in the pipeline?
There is some really exciting stuff happening right now. The biggest news is a drug called centanafadine. It is currently under priority review by the FDA with a target decision date of July 24, 2026. It is what we call a triple reuptake inhibitor, or an NDSRI. It hits norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin all at once.
A triple threat. How is that different from what we have now?
Well, it is being positioned as a non-stimulant with low abuse potential, but because it hits all 3 pathways, the phase 3 trials are showing it might be much more effective for core focus than the older non-stimulants like Strattera. It is aiming for that holy grail Daniel mentioned, stimulant-level efficacy without the schedule, 2 restrictions, or the massive cardiovascular load.
That would be a game changer. What about things that aren't drugs at all? We talk a lot about tech on this show. Are there digital therapeutics that are actually showing promise?
There are. We've talked about Endeavor RX for kids, but now there is Endeavor OTC specifically for adults. It is an FDA-cleared video game treatment that uses specific sensory stimuli to target the neural systems involved in attentional control. It is not going to replace Vyvanse for an adult with a high-pressure job, but as a supplementary treatment, it might allow someone to use a much lower dose of medication, which solves that blood pressure concern.
I think about the sweet spot not just as a new molecule, but as a more personalized way of using what we already have. We're getting better at pharmacogenomics, testing your DNA to see how you metabolize these drugs. Some people are fast metabolizers of stimulants, so they get a huge spike and then a crash. Others are slow, so the drug builds up in their system and ruins their sleep.
Exactly. If Daniel knew exactly how his liver was processing these meds, his doctor could tailor the dose much more precisely. We are moving away from the try this for a month and see if you feel like a zombie phase of psychiatry and moving towards something more data-driven.
You know, it is interesting that Daniel mentioned the stress of Strattera. I wonder if there is a psychological component to that sweet spot too. When you take a stimulant, there is often a euphoric or motivational kick in the beginning. Some people argue that is a side effect. But for someone who has spent years feeling lazy or unmotivated, that feeling of, I can do this, is a huge part of the therapeutic benefit.
That is a controversial point in the field. Some clinicians want to eliminate that kick because they see it as a sign of potential abuse. But for the patient, that shift in internal monologue is often what allows them to start building the habits they need. Non-stimulants don't give you that. They are more like a background process. You just notice 3 weeks later that you didn't lose your keys as often. It is less rewarding, even if it is technically working.
It is the difference between a coach giving you a pep talk and just having better sneakers. Both help you run, but the pep talk changes how you feel about the race.
I love that. And for someone with high blood pressure, the pep talk of a stimulant might be making their heart race too much. So maybe the future is a combination of a very low dose, smooth stimulant for that salience, and a non-stimulant like guanfacine to handle the background noise and protect the heart.
It feels like we are in this transition period where the science is there, but the medical system is still catching up. We have all these tools, alpha agonists, prodrugs, genomic testing, but most people are still just getting a standard prescription and a good luck.
And that is why being an informed patient is so important. Daniel is doing exactly what he should be doing, tracking his reactions, understanding the difference between norepinephrine and dopamine, and asking about comorbidities like hypertension. If you can go to your doctor and say, I think I need to look at an alpha-2 agonist to buffer the cardiovascular effects of a stimulant, you are going to get much better care than if you just say, the meds make me feel weird.
It is about becoming the architect of your own treatment plan, which, again, is hard when your executive function is struggling. But it is why having a support system, or even just a podcast like this to help frame the ideas, can be a lifeline.
Speaking of framing ideas, I think we should talk about the non-medical sweet spot for a second. We've been talking about pills, but for a lot of people, the environment is the biggest non-stimulant factor. If you can change your environment to require less focus, you don't need as much medication.
The pills don't teach skills mantra.
Exactly, but it goes deeper. It is about scaffolding. If I use a digital assistant to handle all my norepinephrine tasks, the alerting and reminding, then my brain only has to handle the dopamine tasks, the actual creative work. That reduces the total cognitive load, which in turn reduces the amount of medication I might need to stay afloat.
I wonder if Daniel has explored that. He is a busy guy, and sometimes the pressure we put on ourselves to perform like neurotypicals is what drives us to seek higher and higher doses of stimulants, which then triggers the blood pressure issues. It is a feedback loop.
It really is, and the stress of the bureaucracy adds to that. Think about the physical toll of being on your last 2 pills, calling the pharmacy, being told they are out of stock, and knowing your work performance is going to tank in 48 hours. That stress alone will spike your blood pressure more than a 5 milligram Adderall would.
That is such a good point. The system itself is a health risk for people with ADHD.
It really is. I want to go back to Daniel's question about where pharmacotherapy is headed. There is a drug that has become a big player recently called Qelbree, or viloxazine. It is another non-stimulant, but it works slightly differently than Strattera. It is a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, but it also has some activity on certain serotonin receptors that might help with that stress feeling Daniel described.
Is it showing better results for focus than Strattera?
The data is promising, especially for people who didn't respond to atomoxetine. It seems to have a slightly faster onset of action, maybe a week or two instead of a month. It still has the cardiovascular warnings, but for some, it seems to be a cleaner feel. It is not the sweet spot yet, but it is another arrow in the quiver.
It feels like we are slowly chipping away at the problem. We are moving from one size fits all to we have 5 different sizes, and eventually we will get to custom tailored.
I hope so, and I think the recognition of ADHD in adults is driving this. For a long time, this was seen as a childhood disorder. But when you are treating a 40-year-old with a career, a mortgage, and a history of hypertension, you can't just throw Ritalin at them and hope for the best. The stakes are higher, and the physiology is more complex.
So, if we were to give Daniel some takeaways from this deep dive, not medical advice, obviously, because we are just 2 brothers in Jerusalem with a lot of books and a microphone, but what are the themes he should be thinking about?
First, I would say, don't give up on non-stimulants just because Strattera was a bust. The alpha-2 agonists like guanfacine are a completely different mechanism and might be the missing link for someone with high blood pressure. Second, look into the combination therapy approach. It is not an either-or. Sometimes a very small amount of a stimulant with a buffer medication is the safest and most effective route.
And third, don't underestimate the impact of the bureaucracy on your health. If the monthly struggle for a Schedule II drug is causing massive stress, that is a legitimate medical factor to discuss with a doctor. Maybe there are longer-acting formulations or different delivery methods that can bridge the gap.
And finally, keep an eye on the sweet spot research. We are moving toward a world where we might be able to target the focus parts of the brain without hitting the heart rate parts of the body. It is a matter of precision.
It is a lot to take in, but it is also hopeful. The fact that we even know enough about dopamine and norepinephrine to have this conversation is a huge leap from where we were 20 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. Back in the day, it was basically, here is some speed, hope it works. Now we are talking about receptor affinities and synaptic reuptake ratios. We are getting there.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Daniel, thanks for sending that in. It is a topic that affects so many people, and your specific experience with the stress of non-stimulants is something I think a lot of listeners will relate to.
Definitely. It is a journey of trial and error, which is frustrating, but every failed trial is actually just more data to help you find what eventually works.
Before we wrap up, I want to say a quick thank you to everyone who has been listening. We've been doing this for 485 episodes now, and the community that has grown around my weird prompts is just incredible. If you are enjoying these deep dives, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or whatever podcast app you use. It genuinely helps other people find the show.
It really does. And if you want to see our back catalog or send us your own prompt, head over to myweirdprompts.com. We have everything archived there, including our previous episodes on ADHD like episode 344, which goes into the practical side of navigating life after a diagnosis.
Yeah, there is a wealth of stuff in the archives. You can also find our RSS feed there if you want to subscribe directly.
All right, I think that is it for today. Corn, any final thoughts?
Just that the sweet spot might not be a single pill, but the balance we find between the chemistry, our environment, and how we treat ourselves. It is a work in progress for all of us.
Well said. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next time.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.